Clark. I'm assistant professor of practice in the art and art history department at the University of Texas at Arlington. This is part of our virtual visiting artist program for the fall of 2020. And we're starting with interviews with our new faculty hire. And we have today Fletcher Coleman, who is our new art and art history hire. And we are just beyond delighted to welcome you, to have you in our department and have you here in Texas. Hi, Fletcher, how are you?
Hi, everyone. It's a delight to be here. I'm very excited to be here and settled down and looking forward to joining the UTA community.
Good. And you're coming from Notre Dame, is that correct?
Yeah, I spent the past 2 years as a doctoral fellow at the University of Notre Dame. I had the interesting pleasure of being the first professor of non-Western art at the University of Notre Dame and the history of the institution. And I put those air quotes there because my specialty is in primarily Central Asian and Chinese art history, but I was teaching sort of a very broad swath of introductory materials at Notre Dame, given that it had never been formally taught there before.
I'm so interested in learning more about your background. For those of you who will watch later, this is really my first time to meet Fletcher, so I'm just as eager probably as everyone else that will watch this to learn a little bit about your background, your specialty, where you grew up, those kinds of things that I think really add to the story of who we are as professors and what we bring to the table as educators as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I brought just a few pictures in a slideshow here as well, and I'll start off with a fun one here. Let me see if I can do this share content correctly. So my interest in art history actually started out with an interest in studio art. So I grew up on a small farm in rural Ohio, and I ended up there because my father was a glass blower, and he had grown up in California, and he was one of the first MFA students in glass blowing at Kent State University, just as sort of the studio glass movement was taking off in the US really over the course of the 1960s. And so he ended up in Ohio for his MFA. And then he taught for a few years and established the glass blowing and ceramics department at the Columbus College of Art and Design in Columbus, Ohio, and then left sort of the academic world and founded his own studio on our farm. And we operated the farm as a corn and soybean farm, and he ran his glass blowing studio. And you can see me here. I spent most of my childhood as what I like to call free labor, working for him in his studio, which was a great experience, in hindsight. And then also my mother was a printmaker by training and did botanical drawings. And so they would, on a very small scale, sell their artwork at shows around the country, craft shows. And I would go and I would work with my father and my mother, and then we would operate the farm together. And so I did that growing up and, ultimately decided that the studio art path wasn't for me with my direct interests, but I really had a love for art. And so when I went and started out as an undergraduate, I initially, had this idea of being a lawyer. And so I was a poli-sci economics double major for about one semester. And I was taking art history and Chinese language courses at the same time and loved those two courses so much that I switched my majors and ended up a Chinese language art history double major. And it was really fascinating for me because as part of my upbringing, we were a low-income family, and I grew up in sort of outside of what would you consider maybe a classic Rust Belt town in Ohio, small factory town. The school district I went through, we didn't have much in the way of language courses. And so I wanted to take something that I thought was kind of far out, I guess. And I went to a language fair and was introduced to Chinese language by the department chair. And I said, I heard Chinese language is really difficult. And he said to me, oh, no, it's actually quite easy and it's very interesting. You should give it a shot. And when I graduated 4 years later, I said to the chair, I really did find Chinese language interesting, but, I think it was kind of challenging. And you told me it would be really easy. He said, oh, I said that? That was a complete lie. But I'm glad you liked it. So
he had to get you in somehow, right?
Yeah. So his trick worked, but I really loved it. And I found a lot of interesting cultural connections to my own background in China and have really loved it ever since.
That's fantastic. Now, you kind of were talking about your entry into China and Chinese art through language. Was that how you got to art history, really, through the language?
Yeah, it's a little bit of both. I would say I got to Chinese culture through language. So I began taking introductory Chinese language as an undergraduate. And then it was through that I began to be introduced to other aspects of traditional Chinese culture. And I had a really wonderful advisor, and he was a specialist in Taoist studies, which is what's generally thought of as the true indigenous Chinese religious tradition. And so I began taking courses on Chinese religions and the classical Chinese language fairly early. And when I say classical Chinese, with the fall of the last Chinese imperial dynasty in 1911, the language was fully, well, actually a little bit prior to that, but it was fully modernized in the sense that the written language began to match the vernacular spoken language. But prior to that, there had been a high register of written language which existed, which you can think of essentially as kind of the difference between written Latin and spoken Italian. So scholars and government officials were using this, what was sort of archaic written language, which we refer to generally as classical Chinese, up until that point. And so I had to then train in that as well, and I was introduced to that as an undergraduate. And that kind of guided my interest to earlier periods of Chinese culture and history. And at the same time, I was taking art history courses, both centered on primarily Italian Renaissance art, as well as Japanese and Chinese art. And so I began to combine the two interests. And that really occurred when I traveled to China for the first time during my sophomore year as an undergraduate. And while I was in China, I was primarily based at a language school in Beijing. And I had the opportunity to go and visit museums, traditional historical sites, and start to really build that interest up. And when I came back from that trip, I was really set in Chinese art history in particular. Yeah, I knew that was what I was interested in. I came to learn that area studies, or the study of a particular region or culture, really allows you to encompass very broad interests from your own background. So I had wide-ranging interests, and I realized, not only did I have this affinity and interest in China, but I could combine all of these background interests through the study of this particular region. And so it was really fascinating to me. And I have to say also, I just really loved all of the people that I interacted with, the families that I stayed with. And, my father had a great sense of humor, and he liked to tell jokes. And I found that most people I interacted with had wonderful senses of humor as well. And so it was just, a lot of great overlaps, and I really enjoyed it.
Well, I think we have to end our great conversation interview, and I can't thank you enough for taking the time. And it sounds like you're ready to go for your semester by just the info that you just gave me. So you don't have much prep work in the next 2 weeks like I have. But thank you, and again, for all those people who watch this, there's a lot more content that we're pushing out there in the Visiting Artist program. I hope you stay tuned and will participate in that. Again, thank you, Fletcher, and we'll be seeing a lot more of you around campus and I guess on Teams.
Well, it's been a pleasure, and I look forward to getting to know everybody here at UTA. And you're always welcome to reach out to me, professors and students alike, if you have any questions about Central and East Asia, or if you're looking for any other opportunities as well. My profile will be going live soon on the departmental website, and all my contact information will be up there. So thanks so much, and I look forward to learning more about UTA myself.
Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.